Welcome. I'd like to share with you now what I consider to be the ultimate skin retouching technique. This was shown to me by Alessandro Bernardi, and he calls this frequency separation retouching. And we'll see what that means a little bit later on. But let's jump in here. We're going to again work with my sister here, who has given us permission to look at the before retouching photo right here. And she's quite a beautiful woman, but not as young as she used to be, and so we're going to give her a little help here. Okay, so this is how it goes. First, we're going to duplicate the background 2 times. So I'm going to make 2 copies of it. This top copy is going to be our texture. And the middle copy here is going to be the blur. All right, so let's turn off this top copy just for a minute because we're going to work on the blur first. But before I do anything else, I'm going to change this into a smart object. So I go Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Object. And this is so that I can undo the blur and apply a different kind of blur. So we'll see how this works now. We're going to give this just a little bit of blur. So I'm going to go Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And now what I'm looking for here is just enough blur to kill the skin texture. So, if we go too far down, I can still get a sense of the skin texture here. So I have to find a radius that just smooths out the skin texture. I'm not so concerned about the major features here, just the skin texture, and it's looking to me like, maybe, well, let's just say 5. We'll give it a nice even number, and we'll do 5 pixel radius. Okay, now that that's blurred, we're going to turn on that top layer. And now the first in a series of sort of trick moves here, we're going to go up to Image, Apply Image. Now, Apply Image is an interesting calculation where we can take any layer and apply it against any other layer. So in this case, what I'd like to do is apply that blur to the texture, which is the layer that we have targeted. And we're going to use an unusual calculation here. We're going to subtract. So the blending mode will be subtract. And this is very important to set these numbers up here. We want a scale of 2 and the offset of 128. This 128 means that the most of the image will be medium gray, which is important for calculation reasons later on. But in essence, by subtracting, we're going to end up with the difference between the blurred image and the sharp image in just the high frequency range of 5 pixel radius. So we're just going to get the texture of the skin in this layer, and we'll see how we use that in a minute. Okay, so now we have the texture in this sort of very gray looking layer on top, and we have the blur image on the bottom. And if we change the apply mode now of the texture to linear light, the image now returns to full focus and full color. And it's identical, if I solo this background layer now, it's identical to what it was before. Okay, now I'm going to take this blur layer and throw away the filter that I just applied to it. So it will return to full focus. So I'm going to grab this Gaussian Blur Smart filter here, and let's throw that away. And you can see now the original sharp texture is now actually sharpening the image. So it's sort of an interesting way of doing sharpening. But we're going to do something else now. I'm going to go back to my blur layer, and let's turn off the texture layer first. So I'm going to go back to the layer that is going to be blurred again, and this time we're going to use a different type of blur. I'm going to use blur, surface blur. And the idea here is to get a nice smoothing effect, a nice blurring effect in the skin, but not to spread the blur too far into the dark areas and the major edge transition. So we can still see the color of the lips and the eyes, and major edge transitions kind of stay unaffected. This is due to the threshold setting and the radius. The radius determines how blurry the image is, and I want a nice, good, even blur. I want everything to be really smoothed out, and we can kind of look in the image and decide if we've achieved enough smoothing. And it kind of looks like maybe around 40 pixels is good. Let's see here. Yeah, so I still have a sense of the highlights, but it's very nicely smoothed out. The threshold determines how much of the image gets blurred. So if I use a very small threshold, only small areas that have very little change in them, like a change less than 19 levels, those will get smoothed. So I have to find a high enough level here that most of the skin gets blurred without too much. So like I want kind of the wrinkles under the eyes to go more away. So we're going to increase that just a bit. Looking probably around 60 gives me enough smoothing. Maybe a little more. Okay. So now we're done with our new blur. So now watch what happens when we turn back the texture. So I'm going to turn this top layer on. Okay. So I've got that top layer of texture turned on, but now look how different this looks than the original. It looks sharp, but this is what the original looked like. So it's pretty dramatic. What we've essentially done is separate the smoothing and the texture, but it's just the fine texture. You see, we've got the texture of the skin, and because it's in a separate layer, we can kind of deal with the texture separately. And it's also in this sort of interesting gray layer. So let's look at this. Here is something that we can do to minimize the wrinkles under the eyes without completely killing the texture. So I'm going to turn this now back from linear light back to normal so we can look at it. And just to kind of see what we're doing, I'm going to add a temporary contrast curve on top. So I'm just going to make an adjustment curve that I'm going to throw away later. But just for visualization purposes, I'm just going to make a very contrasty effect here. So now we can really see the texture. I'm going to work on this layer, and I'm going to use the paintbrush, and I'm going to paint with 50% gray. So I come into the color picker here, and I'm just going to move it so that I've got 128, 128, 128. It's a medium gray. And now let's apply this paint in lighten mode. Okay, so it can't make anything darker. It can only make it lighter. So we're going to preserve the highlight texture of the skin, but I'm going to, in essence, lighten up the darker wrinkles here. So I'm going to use 30% opacity, so we just do it a little bit at a time here. And I'm just going to paint in. And you can kind of see the wrinkles getting lighter. So I'm going to go around and sort of work the dark wrinkles a little bit, just a couple of strokes here. And it's not affecting, at the moment, it's not affecting the lighter highlights on these wrinkles. Just the darker parts of the wrinkles. And now I'm going to go back to normal, and we'll just hit it a couple of times just to knock back the highlights just a bit without doing as much to knock them back as we did with the shadows. And you can kind of work different parts of the face. See, like here's an area that I'd like to smooth down. It has a kind of a highlight in it and a shadow. So I'm going to go in there and just kind of work that to smooth that little area out because it's a little crocodile-y. And okay, for now that's all I'm going to do. Let's throw away or let's turn off our contrast here. And this is now what this looks like. And we'll change that back to linear light and check it out. So now you can see I've really softened the wrinkles. They're still there, but they're sort of knocked back. And again, let's go back and look at the original. Okay. So quite a dramatic effect there. Now here's something else you can do. Again, we can actually attack the texture with traditional retouching approach, and that actually makes it easier to retouch when we're dealing with this gray layer here. So again, I'll turn on my visualizing contrast here. And I'm going to work again in the texture layer, and I want to take out this crease here. So there's a couple of different approaches, and sometimes the best way is just to use the old school method using the clone stamp. So here I'm going to select the clone stamp tool here, and I want to pick a sharp edge. One of the problems with cloning over and over into an area is that you can tend to make it too soft, and that's due to using a soft edge in the clone tool. So we're going to use a hard edge and a small brush, and we're literally just going to kind of sample and then just sort of click and dab to try and move that wrinkle out. And I keep resampling, so I'm picking a different area. This is sort of very old school retouching, but sometimes it's the best. Now I'm going to work that highlight. Okay, so now I've eliminated all the features that I don't like, and again, I'm looking at a very contrasty version of this. If we turn off the contrast, we can see that the texture is much more subtle. There's some other approaches that we can take to some of this. For instance, we can use the spot healing brush. If I select that, and I can kind of move in here. My goal here is to get rid of some of the darker, like spots and crevices here, where the lipstick sort of piled up in the edges here. And so I'm just going to kind of smooth that out a little bit, just using the spot healing brush. And we'll go up here to so sometimes the clone stamp tool is better, sometimes the spot healing brush. Sometimes I think the spot healing brush can get too soft looking. It depends. It depends on how big an area you're trying to spot. So sometimes we can just use the spot healing brush to sort of color in a big area, and then it gets replaced with surrounding skin texture. I always use spot healing now with content aware selected. And we're also careful, we're not sampling all layers here. I'm just working on the texture layer by itself. So I want to make sure that I'm not incorporating the contrast into the retouching. So I want to make sure I don't have sample all layers checked. And here's another one we can probably just color and replace the whole thing. There we go. Okay, so let's now return to linear light and check out our work. Zoom back out. Okay, so there's that chin area and where we were before and where we are now. So you can see I've actually still managed to preserve the high frequency texture of the skin, but the lower frequency bumps and bulges and dark shadows and things like that just sort of go away in this using this technique. And we can go around and fix anything in the texture that we want to help smooth it out more. But now we're going to move on. We're going to consider this good enough for now. And one thing that the blur tends to do is it sort of softens the contrast a little bit, and sometimes that can look like too much. So here's a little trick for getting back some of the contrast. So I'm going to turn off my texture, and there's my soft, smooth skin from the blur layer. Okay, I'd like to duplicate this the smart object layer, and I'm going to be using an image adjustment type on it. So the problem is that the smart object status sort of interferes with that. So I want to get a duplicate of this layer, but I don't want the duplicate to be a smart object. So I'm going to actually now merge visible into a new layer. So the trick for doing that is to hold down the Option or Alt key and then select merge visible while you hold down that Option or Alt key. Okay, so we select merge visible, and now we get an exact duplicate of the blurred layer, but it's no longer a smart object. So that allows us to go over here and apply a hue saturation. I want to take the color out of this. Okay, so I just desaturate it. And now I'm going to run a high pass filter over it. So I go Filter, Other, High Pass. And I'm looking, high pass can sort of be used for sharpening effects if you use very low radius. I'm actually looking for a more sculptural kind of effect. So I'm going to go for a higher radius here, which shows me the highlights and shadow transitions here. And that's probably good. Now we can change the apply mode here from normal to overlay, and we get a contrast enhancing effect. It kind of looks like it's sharpening this blur layer, but it's really just enhancing the contrast. The blur is still evident, and now when we add the texture back, what I've got is sort of snap the contrast a little bit. Now everything, this smoothing effect has been applied to everything, and it looks kind of ridiculous in the hair. We don't want, and let's look at the original again. The hair looks fine, looks natural. and here it looks a little strange. So we just want this smoothing to be applied over the skin. So I'm going to take and select all three of these layers. I'll hold down the Shift key here so I can select multiple layers. And once I have these layers selected, I'm going to put them into a group. So I go over here to my layer options and I select new group from layers. And this is going to be our skin smoothing. Okay, so there's our skin smoothing, and this, I have all three of these layers in here so that I can control them with one layer mask. So now that I have that in there, I can create a layer mask for that whole group. And first I'm going to hide it, so I'll hold down the Option or Alt key and click on that little layer mask icon, and I get a black layer mask, and I've hidden all of the smoothing effect. So now we'll select a regular brush, and I'm going to brush with white paint into the black layer mask in the areas where I want the smoother skin. So I'm going to go back to 100% opacity here, and I'll pick a little bit larger brush. And now all I really have to do is just sort of brush into that area, and I'm going to smooth out, sort of iron out the skin here. And the nice thing about using the surface blur in the blurring part of this technique is that I can kind of go into the hair a little bit without getting a dark halo around it, or causing a kind of smudge like at the edge. And I can still get nice smoothing effect here, like what happens to the neck area down here. And our hand, let's do the hand as well. So you can see I knock back the bulge of those veins, but I still preserve the texture of the skin. Okay, now here's a little tip for making sure that you don't have holes in the layer mask, or that you've covered everything that you intended to cover. I'm going to go back here, and we're going to turn the texture back, the texture layer back to normal, so we'll see all this gray, right? That's where the layer mask is painting over the skin. So I can go back here, reselect the layer mask, and continue painting to make sure that I fill in any little holes, so I know that I've got my smooth texture everywhere I want it to be. And I can kind of zoom in and do a little more detail work around the eyes here. So in general, I want to keep this smoothing out of the hair and away from really sharp details like the eyes, but everywhere else I can pretty much cover everything up. And I remember I worked the edges of the lips, so we'll make sure that we cover that a bit. And we'll smooth out all of the skin in the hand. You get the idea. So I want to come back in and just make sure I don't have any holes anywhere, and I'm not going to finish this all out here, but that's just to show you that way of visualizing to make sure that you have all the skin covered up. So now we got to go back to the texture layer and change it back from normal back to linear light. All right, now let's back out a little bit. Again, look at our original, look at our smooth, original, smooth. And as usual, with any kind of retouching like this, you can always change the opacity of this to bring back a little bit more of the reality of the original photo. So instead of taking 15 years off of her, we can take 5 years off of her, or something like that. The other thing you can do, because you can sort of work underneath this texture without harming it at all, we can kind of work the highlights on the face. If I put another layer here, just an empty layer, I can sample a highlight color with my brush, and I can sort of work this in. Let's work it in very slowly. Again, I'll go back to 30% or maybe even 20% here, and I can kind of like maybe smooth out, spread that highlight a little bit. Maybe add just a little more highlight on the cheek here, a little more on the chin. Sometimes, just a little extra on the nose. Play the highlights this way, and it can kind of sometimes help just smooth out the impression of the modeling on the face. Okay, well I think I've demonstrated at least what the technique is, and you can modify this and do lots of stuff with this. It's very flexible, and I'm so glad that Alessandro Bernardi was so kind enough to share this with me so that I can share it with you. Thank you.